Good. So today I'm excited to share this class with you, what goes around perspectives on pandemics in Jewish history. Because today's course is going to teach us six. I'm just going to mute everybody so it's going to be easier to have this conversation. If anybody wants to say something, please feel free to unmute yourself. What we're going to learn tonight in perspectives on pandemics in Jewish history is 6 vital pieces of information. 6 vital practical things that you can do just like our ancestors have done over the past few thousand years throughout their pandemics. What lessons we can learn from history. Can you hear me? 6 practical things that you can do to ward off this pandemic, as well as 1 game-changing shift in perspective that is critical to helping us secure the salvation that we need at this very critical time. For starters, I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. Are you able to see my screen, friends? Can you give me a thumbs up if you see my screen? You do? Fantastic. Okay, good. We're going to learn tonight in this discussion we're going to divide this into 3 parts. The first section is going to be talking about practical guidance, medical advice found in traditional Jewish sources. The second part will be talking about religious and spiritual responses to pandemics. And in the third part of the class, we'll be talking about how pandemics have shaped and influenced Jewish life to the point that there are things that we do today that you might never have guessed are actually born out of pandemics that our ancestors have experienced. That's 3 parts of the class. Number 1 is practical and medical guidance. Number 2 is spiritual and religious reactions to pandemic. And number 3 is how pandemics have changed how we live our lives as Jews. And that's going to lead us to those 6 critical actions that you can take to change the course of this pandemic, and 1 game-changing perspective in our perspective in order to be able to approach this with the right attitude. So for starters, I'm going to start off with the practical guidelines. And at the very beginning, I'd like to start off with the Talmud and Tractate Ketubot, folio 77b, where the Talmud discusses methods to prevent the transmission of a certain infectious disease called Ra'atan, as recorded in the Talmud. And then the Talmud tells us 4 pieces of advice. Number 1, Rabbi Yochanan tells us, this is 2,000 years old, friends. Rabbi Yochanan tells us, be careful of the flies found on those afflicted with this highly infectious disease called Ra'atan, because they are the carriers of this disease. Isn't that interesting? This is long before we knew anything about viruses and bacteria and germs and dirt and schmutz. Rabbi Yochanan of the Talmud tells us, be careful of the flies because they are the ones that transfer the disease from one to another. A second teaching there in the Talmud is Rabbi Zera, who made sure never to sit downwind from the direction of someone afflicted with the Ra'atan. Once again, we see the sages of the Talmud intuitively aware of something well ahead of their times, way ahead of scientific research. They knew that the wind is what carries this invisible disease. A third of 4 points in this Talmud and Tractate Ketubot is Rabbi Elazar, who wouldn't even enter the same tent as someone afflicted with Ra'atan. Now doesn't that sound like social distancing that we are experiencing today? Don't be indoors with people that are afflicted with coronavirus. And finally, this one's a little bit enigmatic. The 4th one, we're not quite sure exactly what it's talking about. Rav Ami and Rav Asi would not eat eggs from an alley in which someone afflicted with Ra'atan lived. Science hasn't caught up with this one yet. We're not quite sure what's up with these eggs of the alley, and how they fit into this picture of somehow transmitting this highly infectious disease. But certainly what we've seen from this piece of Talmud in Ketubot, that it sounds very similar to what we've been learning today, to what we hear about in the news, social distancing. We hear about masks, because it's the air that we breathe, it's the sneezes, it's the flies. You got to be careful to keep yourself very sanitary. Wash your hands. Don't allow any schmutz near you. The Talmud elsewhere in Tractate Bava Kama goes further to give us two more pieces of advice regarding a pandemic. This time from the 4th century Babylonian rabbi by the name of Rava, who kept his windows shut during an epidemic, once again, transmitted not by touch, not by adjacency, but merely by the flow of the wind. And one final piece of Talmud here, the rabbis advised that when traveling during an epidemic, stick to the sides of the road. Now, why did they say you should stick to the sides of the road? The reason that they gave is pretty mystical, because the angel of death typically walks along the middle of the road. So if you stick to the side, you should be okay, right? That's what the Talmud says. The angel of death likes to hang out in the middle of the road. But it would seem to be pretty practical advice as well, in the sense that it's the middle of the road which is more busy. And if you want to be socially distanced, then you want to be on the sides of the road where there are less people. And hence we've seen, very, very interesting, 2,000 years ago, Talmudic social distancing measures. In part one of this lesson, we're going to see some very practical advice, not only from the Talmud as we've learned so far, but from the sages of the past 2,000 years, and more specifically of the past 500 years. Practical advice, some of it you might find very surprising, as to what is the what it is that will allow us to be safe from the pandemic, right? So I'm sharing my screen. I can't see exactly who's there. I see Mickey and Cookie and Stephanie. I think that's Karen. Is that Karen Berkner? Can't tell exactly. I think there's a way to do this. I'm not sure. I'm doing quite a sophisticated piece of Zoom onto Facebook right now. So I can't tell. I see Sandy Boynton and Susan Benson and Warren Ellick. Stacy Thor is there. Tiki and Ashley. I can't tell everybody who's there, but pretty much for the most part. So I want to thank everybody for being here with me as we take on this very, very interesting topic together, as well as our friends from the Bnei B'rith Justice Unit out of the lawyers of the Jewish lawyers of Broward, with the lawyers and judges. Great to have you guys with us. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to comment or post in the chat. I would love to hear from you. I think Mickey's trying to say something.
Yeah, Rabbi, your screen share isn't working correctly.
My screen share is not working?
It's working correctly. You're showing a portion of and your preview. You're not doing a whole screen on your screen share.
I'm not doing a whole screen? I'm not sure exactly how that works. So you can only see a portion of my screen?
Rabbi, you're okay.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, let's not sweat the small stuff, Bob, right? We're here. We got to focus on the good stuff. All right, Mick, I hope we can work it out, hopefully. Anyway, so let's go now to the last 500 years to see how the sages of the past 500 years have reacted to pandemics. Practical, down-to-earth advice. In the Code of Jewish Law, printed in 1555, the Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. Many of us have visited his shul in Tzfat, in the north of Israel. We actually went to his shul, where you actually see the platform where the Code of Jewish Law was actually codified. And he writes in the code that, if possible, one should escape a city when an epidemic appears in it. One mustn't rely on miracles or risk his life. In fact, the co-author of the Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, who was from Krakow, Poland, he actually fled in 1555. He ran away from the great city of Krakow during an epidemic. So that's certainly good advice, is to get out of town, which is what we do today, the quarantine, the shelter at home. Just stay safe, stay away from the people. We find very practical advice. Moving forward to 1831, Rabbi Akiva Eger is the one who actually gave us very practical advice for how to run the synagogues during a pandemic? How do you deal with crowds, with groups of people, with congregations during a pandemic? And he ruled that during the pandemic, a minyan should be, our show right now is limited based upon a 6-foot social distancing measure, right? We calculated, I think it was 15 square feet per person. But that's why we have 48 people in our shul and max right now. But Rabbi Akiva Eger, a great codifier of 1831, he ruled that you shouldn't have more than 15 people during any minyan service, 1-5. And the way to allow everybody to daven together with a minyan would be to have staggered services. So from the earliest time you're allowed to daven, let's say it's 6:15 a.m., from the crack of dawn, you would have quick minyans, express minyans, everybody having their service, having the bare bones minimum of davening, to allow the next group to come into the synagogue, one after the other, to allow every group of Jews, 15 men at a time, to be able to daven, that everybody should be able to fulfill their obligation through a staggered prayer schedule. I imagine that the reason they went for 15 people is because their spaces were simply much smaller back in the 1800s. They weren't able to have beautiful synagogues like we have in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Back then in Europe, it was, I don't think Jews were even allowed to own real estate. So, and certainly in Muslim lands, we weren't allowed to have any homes taller than the mosques. So we weren't allowed to invest in our real estate. I can't imagine that the Jewish homes and shuls were very big at all. If you remember going to Venice, to the Jewish square, you may remember that the way to identify the synagogue in Ghetto Hebraico, in the Jewish ghetto, was that building which has 4 windows on every floor, except for one of the floors which has 5 windows. 5 windows representing the 5 books of the Torah. And that's the secret code as to how to find the synagogue. God forbid that there should be a sign outside during anti-Semitic life in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages of Europe. So synagogues certainly weren't as grand and as majestic as they are today in the United States of America. One final example is 1848, and this one's coming out of Vilna, Lithuania, from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, a very, very dramatic response to pandemics, where Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, his name was Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin, actually, born in 1810, passed in 1883, most famous for his being the founder of the Musar movement, the movement of rebuke and admonishment, a philosophy of Judaism, which is very different to Hasidic approach, which is an emphasis on joy. The approach of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the approach of rebuke, is one which emphasizes not how great man can rise, but how low man can fall. A very interesting approach to Judaism. And he was concerned that people that were physically weak would be susceptible to the disease. And that's what our doctors are telling us today as well. You got to keep fit, you got to stay strong, you got to make sure that you're healthy. And that's why he was concerned back in 1848 that if they'd be fasting on Yom Kippur, they'd lower their immune systems. And that's why he put up billboards around town, he hung placards around the city, urging anyone who felt weak to eat on the holy fast day of Yom Kippur. Can you imagine? Now what happened was that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter himself, the great rabbi of Vilna, he made sure himself after morning services on Yom Kippur to publicly make Kiddush on Yom Kippur in front of many, many people. And he made sure to eat some cake so that everybody would be able to say that the rabbi is eating on Yom Kippur, so that nobody else would feel guilty to eat on Yom Kippur as well. The goal over here, of course, was to stay healthy, to stay strong, that your immune system wouldn't make you vulnerable to the pandemic. What's the philosophy here, friends, as we conclude the first section of our class? As we learn tonight about practical guidance and medical advice to dealing with pandemics from Jewish sages and Jewish sources of law. Is it because we were so afraid of the illness? The answer is no. The reason that we were so stringent with eating on Yom Kippur and limiting the size of the minyans and escaping the city from the pandemic was not because we're so afraid of the illness as much as we are so religiously observant of the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, of preserving human life. There is nothing more powerful than human life in Jewish law. In Jewish theology, there are only 3 commandments that override life safety. If someone puts a gun to your head and he says, I'll shoot you if you don't bow to an idol. Then you're not allowed to bow to the idol. You have to sacrifice your life. Those three sins are idolatry, adultery, and murder. Right? Kill someone else or I will kill you. You're not allowed to commit murder. You have to forfeit your life. So only idolatry, adultery, and murder are the three sins that override the life safety. But every other sin, every other of the 610 commandments of the Torah must be canceled in order to preserve human life. So if your life is in danger, you need to break the Shabbos. If you need to eat treif, if you need to, you remember during the Purim story, Esther decreed a fast during the days of Pesach. There was no Pesach Seder in Shushan that year when Esther was fasting for 3 days together with her fellow Jews, because she knew that their lives were in danger. They needed to fast. So the reason why the rabbis of Jewish history have been so incredibly strict with being careful during the pandemics of Jewish history, is not because we're so afraid of death, but because we're so obsessed with life. I believe it was Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former Chief Rabbi of the British Commonwealth, who said that whereas other religions are obsessed with death, think about it. You walk into a church and what do you see hanging on the wall? You talk to the Muslims and you see what they aspire to is to become a jihad. But in Judaism is a profound rejection of death. It is a celebration of life. We're put on this earth not by mistake, not as a corridor for something, some greater good in another world. No, this world is the purpose of it all. This world is ground zero, and here we are meant to be, to prosper, and to flourish. A second point, which is also just as important, is that the Jewish philosophy to doctors is very different to some other religions. You know, the Christian Scientists, for example, they have a huge problem with doctors because they say, look, God made you sick, so going to a doctor is an act of heresy. If you go to a doctor, it means that you've rejected the will of God. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, also happens to have been a vicious anti-Semite. During a 1527 outbreak of the bubonic plague, he urged Christians who were engaged in a spiritual ministry, such as preachers and pastors, not to leave their churches, but to remain steadfast before the peril of death. Since death is God's punishment, quote, which he sends upon us for our sins, we must submit to God, said Martin Luther, with a true and firm faith, patiently await our punishment. That is not the Jewish approach, my friends. The Jewish approach to doctors is that doctors were endowed with the God-given talent to heal the sick. Verapo yerape is the words of the Torah, and heal, he will surely heal. This means that God gave the mandate to heal to doctors, so that God made us sick, yes, but he wants us to find a way to be healed through the method that he endowed the doctors with. So doctors are agents of God as well, not a rejection of God's will. And therefore, we turn to doctors for healing. By the way, if a doctor tells someone that he only has a certain amount of time to live, that's when we do not listen to the doctors. The Torah mandate given to a doctor is to heal, not to kill. A doctor has no ability, no right, no capacity to project when a person will die. They are given the tools to heal, not to kill, and therefore we are obligated to listen to them, and this in no way is a conflict with our faith. The doctors in Jewish thought are the vehicle through which God delivers healing, and therefore Jewish law is very clear when it comes to medical guidance. One is obligated to follow the guidance of doctors. The Rebbe would always advise people that when you're going through a medical conundrum, to take counsel from a Roife Yadid, which means a doctor who is also a friend. That means a doctor who cares deeply about you. In fact, another sage of Israel, the Tiferes Yisrael, his name was Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz. In 1798, he spoke about Edward Jenner, who developed the smallpox vaccine. And he said about him that he was one of the Chasidei Umma Sa'ilam, one of the Chasidim of the Gentiles of the world, one of the righteous Gentiles who is guaranteed a portion in the world to come. So doctors are really something very special, and we're seeing that today. I was in Miami today, saw a beautiful mural on the wall, which had this doctor like an angel wings holding up planet Earth. Really nice to see that the doctors are like angels of God on this huge mural on the 95. Somehow that they are the agents to bring God's blessing to the world, okay? And that's why when the medical experts today have been telling us, at least during the quarantine, before we reopened that show, when they told us no minyan, no Kaddish, no Shiva, no Torah reading, that's not, when we listened to those doctors, it's not because we were being lenient, but on the contrary, it's because we were being expedient with the observance of the Torah, the law of Torah, which is the sanctity of human life. Okay? And thus we conclude the first of our 3 sections tonight, which is the practical and medical guidance by our sages, by the Talmud, as to how to deal with pandemics. Where we're about to go now in section 2 is really the crux of our discussion tonight. And that is the religious response to pandemics. You know, much of what we've learned so far, we already know. We know about social distancing. We know that flies aren't good for pandemics. We know that you should be careful to stay away, right? To wear a mask and to keep socially distant. But what we don't know, what was nice was to see that the Torah, the sages of the Talmud, have validated everything that we're hearing today in Jewish, in the laws that the doctors are telling us, which is really nice to see. But the novelty of tonight's lesson is the next 6 points, which we're going to be learning from the sages of Jewish history about the spiritual responses, the religious responses to dealing with the crisis of this pandemic. How are we doing so far, friends? Any questions? L'chaim, any questions? Friends, any questions so far? Are we good? I don't know if, I don't know how to unshare my screen. Oh, here it is. Can you see me now, folks? Are you able to see me? I think I was on screen share. But if you have any questions so far, I don't know how to get out of this. Okay, so far it's working. So I'm going to go back to my screen share. Okay, anyways, I think it's working. Pretty sophisticated Zoom, Facebook platform here. So I'm going to pull out my phone just in case there's any questions being posted. I'm going to try to see them through here, through my phone. Hopefully I'll be able to see it. I need like a producer, like we have at the radio station, to be able to track what's going on over here. Okay. 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 All right. I'm not sure if I can connect it from my phone, folks. I can't totally see what's happening on your end. But if there's any questions, I'm going to ask you to just speak your questions because I don't know how to find. Oh, there it is. I think I just found it. Okay, good. I think I just see the comments right now. Great. See if there's any comments. Hopefully I should be able to see them from my phone. Okay. Okay, back to business. So I'm going to move into. Oh, shoot. I'm going to go back into the second section. Boy. Into the second section of the class, which is the novelty of today. The getting an echo, I'm sorry, which is the 6 things that you can do, the spiritual responses to pandemics. And here they are. Generally speaking, we need to understand that the Jewish response to crisis in general, is that we always rely on God for our guidance. But there is the doctrine of anonymity, that God wants to remain anonymous. You see, if God was to provide us with all the blessings that we seek, without us needing, if we were able to see that it comes straight from God, then we would be suffering the disadvantage of losing our freedom of choice. It's only because God chooses to remain anonymous, that God insists on his blessings going through conduits, that he's able to remain anonymous and we can maintain our freedom of choice. An example of these conduits, for example, when God gives us wealth, it doesn't descend from heaven like the manna in the desert of Egypt, the deserts from the Exodus. The blessing of money that God gives us comes through business or through the stock market or through investments or some other sources. The blessings of security and safety will come through our soldiers and our armies and our F-16 fighter jets and our tanks and our training and our political alliances. And our healing also doesn't just descend upon us from heaven, like the Jews of this week's Torah portion who were bitten by snakes. If you remember that story, one of my favorite stories in the Torah, they were bitten by snakes and Moses fashioned a snake on a copper pole for them to look up at. And as they gazed up at the copper snake, they were suddenly miraculously healed. That's not how we get healed today. We get healed through the conduit of the medical doctors. Medicine, doctors, and drugs. So how do we play out this dynamic on the one hand of trusting in God, putting our trust exclusively in God, but at the same time knowing that we must secure the conduit. The blessing is to go through a conduit of the medical doctor. And to do that, we've got 6 different ways of drawing down the blessing. The first one is from last week's Torah portion. Last week's Torah portion was the story of the rebellion of Korach against Moses, the Rebbe, the leader of Israel. And the story famously ends that the rebellion, the mutiny against Korach, and against Moses ended when the people of Korach's rebellion, of his family, actually was swallowed up in the earth. And the other rebels were burned by a terrible fire. But when the people complained, the people that weren't even part of the rebellion, but when the people of Israel complained, it says in last week's Torah portion that a plague swept through the Jewish people and was killing them one after the other, some sort of a coronavirus plague. Until Aaron the high priest, the brother of Moses, stands between the living and the dead, and he literally stops the plague in its tracks. He literally stops the angel of death from sweeping through the people with the plague. What did he use to stop the angel of death? He used a secret that the Satan had revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. You see, when Moses went up to the mountain of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, it says that the angels bestowed gifts upon him. One of the angels that gave a gift to Moses was the Satan, who also is a holy angel of God. And what was the gift that the Satan gave to Moses? It was the secret of how to stop a plague. That secret is called ketoret. Ketoret, which means incense. It was when Aaron offered the incense before God, as is offered daily in the temple in Jerusalem, that special mixture of 11 spices that were put together in the incense. It was that which stopped the plague in its tracks. In fact, the Talmud tells us that this angel of death tells Aaron, please get out of my way. I need to fulfill my mission. You got to take your incense out of my way. You're blocking me. And Aaron says, I'm sorry, I can't move. Moses told me to stay here and stop you from killing the people with your plague. And they have this whole standoff, the angel of death and Aaron. Angel of death sent by God. Aaron sent by his younger brother Moses with the incense to stop the plague. And guess who submits to who? Ultimately, the angel of death sent by God submits to Aaron, sent by Moses with his incense. Fascinating story from last week's Torah portion. Now, why don't we use the Ketoret today? Why don't we also use the incense today, make some incense, and stop the coronavirus, and voila, we'd be all done. Would be amazing. The reason is because you can't offer incense in Palm Beach Gardens. That's why. Incense is a biblical prohibition. Stephanie, you look very surprised. Incense is, we don't normally do it in the synagogue services on Shabbat. You'll notice we don't have sweet smelling incense, right? But what we do have is, that's only offered in Jerusalem in the Holy Temple. It's a biblical prohibition to offer it outside of the temple. But what we do have is a fascinating concept that when we read the verses of Torah relating to the sacrifices, it's considered as if we offered those sacrifices in person. Which is the reason why we read the verses of sacrifices every day. When we read the verses about the daily offerings in the temple, it's considered as if we did them ourselves. When we read the verses of the incense, it is considered as if we have brought the incense. It's a prophecy from Hosea, Unishalma parim sfatenu, and we will pay oxen with our lips by merely learning and reciting the verses of the animal offerings in the temple. It's considered as if we paid them with our own physical bodies. And that's why, friends, you'll notice in the prayer book, in the morning services, you know the Ein Kelokeinu, Ein Kelokeinu, Ein Kelokeinu, right after the Ein Kelokeinu song. In the Chabad Siddur, it's at the end of the morning service. Also on Shabbat. You'll notice there's a paragraph called Pitum Aktoret, the preparation of the incense. When you read that chapter, which describes the various 11 items that go into the incense, it is considered as if you brought the incense. And indeed it was so that the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, said that during a plague, one should read these 3 verses that you see on the screen. These 3 verses, which biblical passages that deal with the incense offerings, this is the first of 6 spiritual responses, 6 religious responses to pandemics. And we see this case study straight from the Torah, last week's Torah portion, where Aaron literally stops the plague that was wiping out the rebels after the demise of Korach. It was the incense, which was the secret given by Satan to Moses on Mount Sinai when the angels were giving gifts to Moses. So the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, the first Chabad Rebbe, tells us to read these 3 verses during a plague in order to receive the blessing of the incense to ward off the pandemic. The first one discusses the making of the golden altar, which is the site of the regular incense offering. The second paragraph discusses the making of the anointing oil and the ketoret, the incense. And the third one relates the part about Korach's rebellion, which I just told you about, last week's Torah portion, the subsequent pandemic, and how the incense actually stopped the pandemic. And now, let's move on into 5 other examples. 5 other things that we can do in addition to the incense. Number 2 of 6 is King David, my namesake. King David was, the Medrash tells us that during the reign of King David, an epidemic broke out, claiming the lives of 100 Jewish people every single day. David was beside himself. He turned to God for guidance. And God revealed to him the remedy, how to remedy the source of the pandemic. The problem was that the people were not reciting 100 blessings each day. That was the problem. They were not reciting 100 blessings each day. See, it says in the verse in Deuteronomy, now Israel, quote, what does the Lord your God ask of you? To walk in his ways and to serve him. What does the Lord your God ask of you? But to walk in his ways and to serve him. The word what in Hebrew is ma. You see it on the screen, right? The word is ma. And the word ma in Hebrew means what? But if you add a silent letter, the aleph, if you add a silent letter to it, ma becomes me'ah, which means 100. So instead of reading it as what is God, your God, asking of you, you can read it as 100 is what God, your God, is asking of you. And that is the secret that was given to King David. When 100 men were dying each day mysteriously through a plague, the second of the 6 responses, spiritual responses to pandemics, is to recite 100 blessings a day. Now, friends, how can you do that? Do you think you're able to recite 100 blessings a day? That's a lot of brachas, friends. A lot of blessings. Let me say this to you. If you do the morning, when you wake up in the morning, you wash your hands and you recite the morning blessings, you follow the prayer book. I gave a course on this on youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. It's youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. You'll see, you'll say Jewish, in the Jewish Life series, you'll see the blessings of the morning. You'll see that there's all sorts of blessings you're supposed to recite upon awakening. If you daven 3 times a day, the morning, afternoon, and evening, and if you eat 3 meals a day, and you make blessings before and after each one of those, you'll be able to reach 100. It's not that easy. But if you think about it, it's just an interesting starting point to be cognizant of the blessings that you make. You made a l'chaim, so you make a blessing before and after. That's 2, right? Maybe you smell some spices, you can make a blessing before. You make the grace after meals with hamotzi, that's another 4 after and 1 before, right? You daven in the morning service. Each one of those, you can actually count and tally up your blessings. It's very interesting. So that's the second of the 6 practical responses. David, are you saying something? Because you're muted. I'm not sure if you are saying something. David, are you talking to me or someone else? Not sure. If anybody wants to comment, please feel free to unmute yourself. But for some reason, I'm not able to see any comments if they are being posted on the chat, okay? So I'm going to keep on going unless anybody unmutes themselves and says something. Okay. The third of our 6 responses, spiritual Jewish responses, is what we see during the Black Death. This is probably the most famous plague in recent Jewish history. So sad that during the Black Death, which actually originated in China, was spread to Europe by the Mongolian invaders following the battle on the Crimean Peninsula, and in what appears to have been the first use of biological warfare, diseased corpses were catapulted towards the besieged Italian-controlled port city, which then transmitted the plague from the corpses to the residents of that Italian port city and spread throughout Europe. During the Black Plague, almost 25 million Europeans and 35 million Chinese died within a decade. Subsequent outbreaks followed over the years. And almost as soon as the disease reached Europe, guess who was blamed for it? Tragically, it was the Jews who were accused of poisoning the wells. It was as if this was our fault, right? Adding insult to injury. Now, anti-Semitism is, of course, not a novelty to the Black Death. In the past 500 years that came even before the plague, the Jewish people were subject to no shortage of persecutions, expulsions from England and France and every other inch of Europe. But the plague brought a new kind of pain, which was not just economic oppression and unfair taxation, it was actual slaughter. That's what we suffered during the Black Plague. Just as a side note, hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed as a result. The Jews of Basel were burned in a structure specially built for that purpose. On the night of Valentine's Day, before it became romantic, more than 1,000 Jews were killed in Strasbourg. Jews were forbidden subsequently from living in that city for the next 100 years, and a mass suicide of Jews took place in Frankfurt in order to avert their terrible prognosis. Why did the Jews survive the Black Plague? The reason we know is because of the very strong hygienic Jewish laws and traditions that may have offered the Jews some protection from the plague. Those, for example, include washing hands before eating. Before we daven in the morning, we wash our hands. When we wake up in the morning, first thing we do is we wash our hands. After the bathroom, we're supposed to wash our hands. Before we eat, we certainly wash our hands. And now when it comes to our dead, it's a mitzvah to bury your dead right away as soon as possible, not to delay. We wash the dead in the tahara process, the ritual purity, and even the laws of kosher, the separation of meat and milk, cleaning surfaces, making sure that everything is clean, there's no residue, right? When we clean out the storehouses of grain for Passover, all of these rituals and mitzvahs are very hygienic and certainly contributed to the Jewish defense from plagues of Jewish history. That's the third of our 6 practical, spiritual, and religious responses. Let's go on to number 4. In the 18th century, Mezhibuz's White Russia, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, he lived from 1698 to 1760. A terrible disease swept through his hometown of Mezhibuz. Men, women, and children were falling like flies. Out of desperation, they turned to the Baal Shem Tov for guidance, and he responded that the annulment of the decree was in the hands of the residents by uniting to create a united Torah scroll. If everybody pooled their resources to write a Torah scroll, that unity of the people, together with the unity of Torah, the connection of Israel, Torah, and God as one unbreakable unity, that would draw down the blessings to heal the people. And indeed, the people pulled some resources together. The Baal Shem Tov had his own scribe actually write the Torah, known as the Miracle Sefer Torah, the Miracle Torah Scroll. That Torah scroll brought as soon as they started writing it, the plague seems to have subsided. And indeed, today, one of the first things that happened is, I know in New York, as soon as the pandemic was going crazy, remember there was a few weeks in New York, people were dying like there was no tomorrow. People that we knew personally. What happened was that they started something called the Unity Torah. You can actually find it right now if you go to the website, unitedforprotection.com. You'll see the Unity Torah. I think they're onto their second or third Torah right now. They've had hundreds of thousands of people participate in the writing of the Torah scroll at unitedforprotection.com. It would be lovely if we could write our own Torah scroll here in Chabad Palm Beach Gardens. We'd love to do that if anybody's interested in being an underwriter for that. But what they've done is that these Torah scrolls have brought the people together from around the world in the most beautiful unity. And you hear tremendous stories of people that were on respirators, people that were more out of this world than in this world, that somebody brought a letter on their behalf, and you hear suddenly that they were brought back to life. There's actually one of the cantors who sang at our first gala here, at our inaugural gala in 2014, Rabbi Chazan Yitzchak Meir Helfgott. He tells a story about how he was literally gone from this world, and somebody brought a letter on his behalf, and wow, he literally came back to life. So that's the writing of the Torah scroll, the fourth of the 6 spiritual and religious responses. The Tzemach Tzedek in 1827 is the third Chabad Rebbe. He wasn't yet Rebbe in 1827. It was his father. It was his father-in-law actually, who was the Rebbe at that time, but his father-in-law was out of town. And the Tzemach Tzedek was then in Lubavitch, in the town of Lubavitch, the home of Chabad. Orsha is a town near Lubavitch. And there was a pandemic there. They asked him for guidance. The Tzemach Tzedek quoted the story from the Zohar about the importance of reading the chapters of incense, as we spoke about earlier. And he also quoted the Talmud, which states that charity saves a person from death. You may have heard the famous story of Rabbi Akiva, whose daughter was destined to die on her wedding night, and she was saved because of a righteous act that she did. And Rabbi Akiva famously declared, Tzedakah tatzel memaves, charity saves a person from death. You are supposed to give charity. Charity is a miraculous defense from the worst decrees, including death. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek at that time called upon the people to add in charity. How much charity are you supposed to give, by the way? Do you have any idea how much charity you're supposed to give? You're supposed to give charity until it hurts. And that is different for every person. For one person, $18 and they feel the pinch. For another person, he gives $180,000 and he didn't even notice that he left his account, right? So every person is different. When you feel the pinch, when you leave your comfort zone for God, that's when God leaves his comfort zone for you, reciprocating your deed. You initiated. God meets you right there in the middle. You went out of your way for him. God is going to go out of his way for you. Specifically, the Tzemach Tzedek instructed them to give charity in multiples of 18. Why 18? Because 18 is the numerical value of the Hebrew word chai, which means life. And that's why ever since then it's become a Jewish tradition that whenever we donate charity, we always try to do it in the multiples of chai, 18, 36, 1.8 million, whatever. You can always tell a Jewish gift when it's in multiples of 18. The fifth instruction we're going to share today. This is when the Tzemach Tzedek grew older. Here's a picture of him on the screen. And this one he's the third Chabad Rebbe. In 1848, he instructed that they should recite the 100 blessings of King David's time, right? That we should all recite 100 blessings. There was a different play going on. And that they should specifically recite these blessings with passion and with meaning, with concentration. You shouldn't just recite them like Baruch Hashem, but you should actually say them with meaning in order to secure the blessing. Remember, we brought a biblical verse that says, what is God asking of you? And we explained it to mean that 100 is God asking of you. God asks you for these 100 blessings. It would be of great benefit to us to give God what he's asking for with great fervor. And perhaps the most interesting is the sixth and final of the directives of spiritual guidance for relating to plagues, responding to plagues. That is what we call the Shvarza Chasana, the black wedding. This tradition, anybody have any idea what a black wedding is? This tradition began in Apt, in the town of Apt in 1892. A community of roughly 6,000 people were dying with the plague, they turned to their holy rabbi who told them that we should invoke the merit of our saintly ancestors. And the way we'll do that is by going straight to their last known address. We will do an act of great compassion and mercy by marrying off an orphan, 2 orphans. I think a female orphan is an urchin, right? By marrying off an orphan and an urchin, I think it is, to each other inside of the cemetery, hence the term a black wedding. Thus, the dearly departed will intervene with the Holy One, blessed be He, to help. And then what they did in 1892 is that they found 2 orphans. One of them was a round orphan. A round orphan means someone who has no parents at all, neither father nor mother. And thus, they were able to marry them off inside of the cemetery. And indeed, they provided them with a gown and with all the money that they needed to get themselves started. And indeed, we found that was during the cholera epidemic, by the way. And during that time, we found that indeed the cholera was able to spare that town from that epidemic. If you think this is a little outlandish, the record, Mickey is indicating that he's very, very much thinks it's outlandish. Well, Mickey, let me tell you some news that in Cobbs Creek, Philadelphia, there's a record of 12. Maybe that's because you're not so desperate, Mickey, by the way. Could be because, thank God, Baruch Hashem, you should never be so desperate. But in Cobbs Creek, in a cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the Spanish flu of 1918, 1,200 people showed up to the wedding of 2 orphans inside of the cemetery in Cobbs Creek in order to be able to find a way to desperately ward off the Spanish flu, which was killing off so many in Philadelphia. And even as recently as in Jerusalem, the other day, a few weeks ago, there was a famous wedding held inside of a cemetery. I watched the video of it. Pretty strange, if I may say so, having a cemetery wedding. Yeah, we got married in, the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, and my brother got married in a cemetery, and, So it's pretty strange, but we understand that this is the 6th and final piece of guidance that we have to share with you here tonight about the spiritual response to the Jewish response or religious response to pandemics. So to summarize, we have the incense, number 1. Number 2 was 100 blessings. Number 3 we said was Torah study. The Jewish rituals and writing the Torah. Sorry, it was writing the Torah. That's what it was. Number 4, the Jewish rituals was Torah study and observing the laws of Torah. Number 4 was writing the Torah. Number 5 was giving charity. And number 6 was the black wedding, organizing a wedding. Why we do this is not because we believe somehow that these are omens that will bring us blessing. At the end of the day, it's only in God that we trust. That's the bottom line. We trust in God, and we're trying to find ways to draw God's blessing upon us, not because we believe in the Torah like some form of an amulet, or we believe in the incense like some sort of magic potion. We just know that God chose to send His blessing of healing through the incense, through the united Torah, through the mechanism of charity, which actually makes a lot of sense. You go out of your way for God, God goes out of His way for you, right? So at the end of the day, here's the bottom line. If you hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, and you do what is proper in His eyes, and you listen closely to His commandments and observe all His statutes, all the sicknesses that I have visited upon Egypt, I will not visit upon you, for I, the Lord, heal you. And that really is the bottom line here. We mention it every year in the high holidays when we say Useshuva, Usefila, Utsadaka, Ma'avirin, Esrei Gezerah, that return, prayer, and charity, they are the ones that avert the evil decree. And that's the crux over here. When you're facing a problem, you want to solve the core of the problem, which is our relationship with God. And that is what's going to secure the salvation. Remember, during the Purim story, this really is the essence of the Purim story, when the Jewish people turned their backs on God by attending that horrible feast of Achashverosh, the feast that was celebrating the death of the Jewish God. We spoke about that another time. It was then that God turned His back upon them. And in order to get everything back on track, Queen Esther ordered this 3-day fast in order to return the Jews back to their commitment to God, so that their fasting would be an indication of their loyalty, pledged once again to God. This is how we Jews respond to crises. And this leads me to the third and final section of our discussion here tonight. After learning the medical and practical responses to pandemics in Jewish history, and the second part, which was the religious and the spiritual responses, the 6 practical things that we Jews can do to respond to pandemics. And we spoke about the mindset shift, which is the problem is not the pandemic. The problem is our relationship with God. Because God sent us the problem, and therefore we turn to God for the solution as well. Teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah, repentance, prayer, and charity, they're the ones that annul the severity of the decree. And now we come to our final part of the class, which is very interesting insights here about the changes in Jewish life. How did Jewish life actually change as a result of pandemics? Let's take a look. So the first changes that happened in Jewish life was that people started realizing that they had to write their wills. So people got very, very involved in writing wills when they saw a pandemic coming up. In Prague, there's a diary, which famously goes back to 1713, that states in the midst of his flight, there was a fellow who was running away. He was on journey somewhere in Prague, and he came to Prague and he realized the plague was there. So this guy availed himself to the court to make provisions. He wrote his will and he made sure that he would settle his affairs, he would settle his debts. You're supposed to buy a grave, by the way. You're supposed to buying a grave is the same as going out with an umbrella, right? When you go out with an umbrella, what happens? It never rains, right? Same thing when you buy a grave, you'll live a very, very, very long life. You won't need it, right? That's how it works. So the same thing over here with when you buy a grave, it's a blessing for a long life. And writing a will, always good to remember to remember your favorite shul in your will is always a nice thing to know. When you write your will, of course, to make sure that when you go to the next world, you're taking tzedakah with you. A second thing that we find is that in quarantine has been an extraordinary opportunity for things to take place. Quarantine is actually an Italian word, which means 40 giorno, 40 days. That when ships came to Venice, the port of Venice, from diseased ports, they were obligated to stay out in the harbor for 40 days until everybody died or didn't die upon the ship before they could get back on the board, before they come back out of the boat. In Jewish law, we know there's a quarantine for those afflicted with the biblical disease of tzaraat. They were sent out of the camp. But the isolation of being in quarantine has actually brought great blessings to humanity. You know that Shakespeare wrote King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra during the 1606 bubonic plague that forced playhouses to close, just like today, right? Isaac Newton developed calculus and the theory of gravity while he was hanging out in the English countryside during another plague year. And my question to you, friends, is what have you accomplished during this quarantine? What have you written? What have you done? How have you changed the world? There were two other great sages that we know of for a fact. The Chidah Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who lived in the late 1700s. He found himself quarantined actually in Livorno, Italy for 40 days. While in quarantine, he wrote one of the first Jewish bibliographies of ancient history. He became one of the fathers of Jewish bibliography when he wrote a book called Names of the Great Ones, Shem HaGadolim, a small encyclopedia of the great Jewish scholars who preceded him in history, together with the names of their books. Okay, that was being a tremendous, tremendous help in Jewish history in the late 1700s. That's what he did during quarantine. And also the Ramah, Moshe Isserlich, who was the author of the Code of Jewish Law in the Ashkenazi tradition. There's two codes of Jewish law interpolated, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. So the Ashkenazi rabbi, the one we learned about earlier from Krakow, who left in 1555, he ran away from Krakow because of the plague. That year for Purim, he wasn't present in Krakow. He couldn't send Shalach Manas to his father. So what did he do? Instead of sending Shalach Manas to his father, the gifts of Purim, what he did was that he wrote a book, which was a Purim-related book, a commentary on the Purim story, called Mechir Yain, which means the price of wine, and that has become a classic in Jewish Jewish philosophy, the book that the Ramah has written. Another interesting adaptation, this one is very, very common. Do you know that Jews would always recite the Mourner's Kaddish in solitude? It was only one person at a time reciting the Mourner's Kaddish. In the shul, you'd have a big minyan, and there was a rotation. Only one mourner at a time was allowed to recite the Mourner's Kaddish. But during 1831 cholera epidemic, there were so many dead people and so many mourners needing to say Kaddish that the rabbis allowed a communal reciting of the mourners Kaddish, which we practice to this very day. It was Rabbi Akiva Eger, the rabbi who said you're only allowed to have 15 people in a minyan, who said that many more than one person can recite the mourners Kaddish in unison, and that is one way that Jewish life has changed since the cholera epidemic. Another interesting one is this one, a concept which we don't really have in Florida. It's called the porch minyan. Have you ever heard of the porch minyan? You know what a porch minyan is? You'll see this in New York, places where people live in buildings, or in Jerusalem. I'll show you a picture. So a porch minyan is people that live close to each other, and they can't, see like in this picture on the right-hand side, they live close to each other. They're not allowed to go to shul. So what they did is that they made minyans on the porches, and they make a minyan with like 18 porches. Everyone gets out in their porch and they daven together. It's like an interesting phenomenon, never been seen before in Jewish history, where we had to daven at home. So they daven at home. Somebody has the Torah, they read the Torah. It's quite an interesting experience. But another interesting evolution of Judaism during quarantines is what you're looking at right now, Zoom. Have you ever heard of Zoom before? I remember flying through the JetBlue terminal in JFK 1,000 times and seeing this huge sign, Zoom. I never knew what it was. But suddenly, everybody's talking about Zoom. It must be the word of the year for Time Magazine 2020, because Zoom is what everybody's doing. This is how we communicate. And I think that life is never going to be the same because we are communicating through Facebook Live and YouTube Live and Zoom. We're communicating in the most unbelievable way. We have classes every single day at facebook.com/Jewish Gardens and youtube.com/Jewish Gardens on Jewish philosophy, on law, on the stories of the ancient kings of Israel, on anxiety and fear and trust. Unbelievable stuff. And we are reaching, like Mickey tells me, the silver lining of the quarantine is that we're reaching 10 or 20 or 30 times more people than we'd ever have reached before this quarantine. In fact, in the past month, we just recently made a calculation. We had 30,000 participants in our Torah study when we were looking at the YouTube and Facebook analytics at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens and facebook.com/Jewish Gardens. It's unbelievable. So this is one thing that's going to change Jewish life forever. One more final interesting thing is the kind of kindness that's going around the world. Extraordinary acts of kindness that people are exhibiting to each other, which is really so beautiful to be able to see the kindness societies, people going out on a limb, people delivering food, running errands, doing incredible things for each other. There was a lady who passed away, an elderly woman from coronavirus in Johannesburg this weekend, this past Shabbos, and her 92-year-old husband was unable to attend the wedding. Unable to attend the funeral. The community went to great lengths to bring this quarantined 92-year-old husband with social distancing measures to the funeral so he could say farewell to his wife. Unbelievable kindness that's going on. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, brilliant Latter-day Talmudic scholar, personally attended to those afflicted with cholera despite the risk, and he did differentiate, very interesting, with levels of risk, stipulating that if the risk of being contaminated was close to certain, you would not be allowed to come in contact with those kind of people, with people that sick. And the Rebbe, we are told from the Rebbe's mother tells us, Rebbe Tzimchana, that when the Rebbe was 20 years old, there was a typhus outbreak in Yekaterinoslav in Ukraine where the Rebbe was growing up. And the Rebbe, people were falling like flies. The Rebbe left his studies and assisted those who were ailing, bringing them aid himself and organizing others to do so. He paid a steep price for his effort. He helped others, but he himself contracted the typhoid illness. And he endured an extremely high fever. She says that at the moments of his highest delirium, he would mutter words of Hasidus, of Hasidic philosophy. And it's certainly the healthcare workers of today that are such angels, the doctors and the nurses that are going out of their way to put themselves in the to put their lives in danger so that ours can be safe. I'd just like to close with a closing comment here, friends, by saying this. We've covered three things today: the medical and practical responses to pandemics in Jewish history. We spoke about the second section, which was religious and spiritual responses to pandemics, 6 different ways to respond religiously to pandemics. And a mindset shift. The problem is not the pandemic. Don't shoot the messenger. The problem is God, our relationship with God, which needs to be fixed. And then we spoke about how Jewish life has evolved as a result of pandemic. But at the end of the day, we know that all the suffering that God brings upon us is but the labor pains, just like a woman about to give birth. that the suffering that she suffers is in order to give birth to great reward, to new life, so too we know that the suffering that we're going through right now is certainly there based on the fairness doctrine, on God's goodness doctrine, that God doesn't just punish us. He gives us challenges like a bow being pulled back so that the arrow can go further. God is giving us a setback in order that we will be able to experience greater progress. We know that the greater the challenge, the greater the reward that follows. And therefore, after the world experiencing such an extraordinary setback, we know that there is a great light that lies behind this darkness, and this is the coming of the Mashiach. There's actually a story of one of the great Rebbes of the previous generation who lived through the Holocaust, and he came to Israel. Throughout all the years of his suffering, he never cried during the Holocaust, but only afterwards, when the war was over and he came to Israel, that's when he would cry all the time. When they asked him, why do you cry now? You didn't cry in Auschwitz and Treblinka. Why do you cry in Jerusalem and Haifa? He said, during all the horrors of the Holocaust, my hope and prayers were that this will end with the coming of Mashiach, the final redemption, the era of enlightenment and higher consciousness of divine revelation. And that thought gave me tremendous comfort. I was willing to endure the suffering in order to experience the benefit that follows. But now that it's all over and I survived and I see that my life is getting back to normal, this is what I was afraid of. Mashiach has not yet arrived, and now I cry out, God, how dare you? How dare you have brought upon us such a tremendous suffering, such anxiety, such trauma and persecution, if all that you gave us was the land of Israel and you didn't give us the ultimate prize, the coming of the Mashiach. The Rebbe promised us the Mashiach is coming in our lifetimes. We're running out of time, friends. I told this to Mickey and Cookie 15 years ago already, and then they were having a hard time believing me. We're running out of time. Mashiach is coming. The Rebbe was never wrong in his prophetic visions of the world. When the Rebbe told us the Mashiach is coming, he knew what he was talking about. It's happening very, very soon. It is our hope and our prayer that during this time of global suffering, that we pray not only for this virus to go away, but that we may soon see the ultimate reward, the coming of Mashiach. No more suffering, no more death, no more COVID. May that all come to fruition immediately.